Because we're here at the National Arts Club, the first question I wanted to ask you, because so many great writers have passed through here over the last century and change, sort of talking about your interest in, from almost from the beginning, in narrative and in fiction and in myth and in poetry. And at the time that you were coming of age in the New York art world, modernism still really, really disdained, that the use of story and narrative and character. And I think about that thing that Philip Guston said when he started to paint figuratively again, and he said, "I got tired of all that purity. I wanted to tell stories again." And I just wanted to ask you, when you decided not to be a painter or a sculptor and gravitated toward performance, what was your interest in narrative and myth?
I'll just say, because I saw the questions before, I thought before we met today, that all of us, or many of us, most of us, read certain, when I was in college and high school and before that, there were certain books that everybody wanted to read. The Russian novels, some of the great novels, we all read them. So it wasn't unusual that I was interested in literature. It's just that I've been brought up on literature. And then I started reading poetry in college at Columbia, and I took a course in modernist poetry. So it was just part of my life and my knowledge and my reference. And that was one of the reasons, because it was there. And then when I didn't switch, I didn't not want to be a painter or a sculptor. I just, as soon as I saw, what inspired me was actually, I saw a performance of Lucinda Childs, which was so odd. It wasn't like what she's doing now, but it was so odd that I was drawn to it. It was one of her early pieces before she started doing the very abstract choreographed dance pieces with many people. And I still love her work, but of course I don't do that. But that early piece was what spurred me on. And I started thinking about it, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. And that's when I decided I wanted to switch from art history and sculpture to performance. But I don't consider that not a desire to do those other disciplines. I had nothing against, by the way, I just want to say now that because Joseph Kosuth said painting is dead, I did not agree with that, That wasn't something that was in my vocabulary. I will say also, Yvonne Rainer had something, a list of forbidden things, and I went against that. I loved her work. I still love her work. But I went against that desire of minimalism.
Right. And I remember reading, and when you decided to take up performance, you wanted to have some understanding about how to move, and you did study with Tricia Brown and Yvonne and with Steve Paxton.
I never studied with Steve.
You didn't?
That his name got in there somehow.
I see.
Okay. You
Okay,
couldn't
good.
study with Steve.
Okay.
But of course, I loved his work. Was amazing. No, but the one thing I think what you're referring to, I was trying to think about that today. And his very early work, one of the earliest pieces I saw, it was in St. Mark's, I think.
At the Poetry Project?
Yeah. No, it wasn't at the Poetry Project. It was a concert of dancers. Anyway, but his dance was just people walking across the room, one after another. And that was another impetus for me, because I was not a dancer, I was not a theater person. I had never studied either of those things, but that made me think, oh, I can enter this world because I can walk.
Right. And what I didn't actually have this in the list of questions I sent you earlier, but was there ever a desire early to become a dancer or choreographer, to go fully into dance?
One thing that cured me was I was taking dance classes. I went to a Merce Cunningham dance. He also had people signing up to be learning dance, and I went to one, and there was a big mirror, and I saw myself leaping across the room. That cured me.
The first, I know that the way that literature made its way into your early work wasn't necessarily narrative. It gave you, you've talked about how it gave you ideas and there was an impetus. And when you did Wad Lao, you had all, I guess, in your peer group started reading Borges because he had just sort of recently, I guess, been translated into English. And that the stories in Labyrinths, particularly, I think, The Garden of the Forking Paths, but then also every reference to mirrors that he had in those collected short stories was a big deal for you. And what did Borges do for you in those years?
Well, I think I'm going to just mention people's names to give them credit because it's the stuff you never read. So Joan Jonas, who was a friend of Renata Adler's, maybe some of you in the room remember Renata's name, she gave him a book of Borges. He had just been translated, and he brought it to me, The Labyrinths. And it was partly because of him, but it wasn't. Anyway, so I read Labyrinths and was immediately inspired. And Borges mentions mirrors all through that. Not The Garden of the Forking Paths is a wonderful title, and I always wanted to do something with it, but I never did. But I love the title, and it suggests so many things. But so I took out all the way I started to work with his text was to take out all the references to mirrors in Labyrinths and all the different short stories, memorize them. And my first performance, I had a dress with mirrors pasted onto it, and I recited by heart all those quotes.
And did you already had an interest in mirrors as a sort of a tool or a prop before Borges, or did
No.
reading Borges begin your thinking about using mirrors?
It was because of Borges. I mean, before that, you mentioned Wad Lao, which I haven't thought about for a while, but that was my very first performance at St. Mark's again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was this. I was rummaging around in Borges today, and I found this thing that I think he wrote much later, but his had a real abiding interest in mirrors throughout his work, and he said, "I look on them as infinite elemental fulfillers of a very ancient pact to multiply the world as in the act of generation, sleepless and dangerous, they extenuate this vain and dubious world within the web of their own vertigo." And which is great. And it seems like part of your use of mirrors in those early performances was, and you've talked about this, to engender some discomfort in the audience. If not vertigo, at least they were looking at themselves.
Well, there were two things. People do not like to have other people see themselves looking in the mirror. In other words, if I was looking at myself in the mirror, I wouldn't want you to see me doing that, I mean, I don't know, maybe everybody's not like that. But anyway, that's one of the things. And part of the performance was passing the mirrors in front of the audience. And so when the mirrors passed by, everybody, of course, including me, would look for themselves. Where am I in that picture? That would be one thing. And then the other thing was they were very heavy glass mirrors. And I did several versions of that. And finally, with heavy glass mirrors, with no backing. And it was dangerous, actually. And we did all kinds of movements with those mirrors. I have to say now, I can say it, no mirror ever broke, which we were very lucky.
Really?
Never. Yeah, never. Anyway, so it also, the audience was made uneasy by that as well. So one of the ingredients in my work is not to make comfortable and easy work, but to have something that's a little, not dangerous but to disturb a little, to put a little bit of edge into it.
Right. And when and there were other writers like H.D., Hilda Doolittle, and Haldor Laxness who provided inspiration for your early work. When was there a point at which you started to think about the work becoming narrative? And I'm interested in asking that question because was there sort of pushback against that? Because it was sort of seen as
nobody pushed.
It was felt like modernism at that point really did not want.
Yeah, but you could do what you wanted to do. It wasn't like a closed system.
Right.
I mean, I know when you read about it, it sounds that way, but it wasn't.
Right.
And I was just going to say something else, but I just.
And how did you come to know about Haldor Laxness and his
Well, I
novels?
spent quite a bit of time in Iceland, where he's from. Halldór Laxness is an Icelandic writer, and I was working on a piece. Another friend of mine, had told me about how wonderful the Icelandic sagas were, and so I read all of the ones I could find that were translated, and I chose one and I made a piece with it. It's called Laxdæla Saga, or Volcano Saga, and while I was in Iceland doing the research and the filming, I found Halldór Laxness.
Right. And you talked, I think I saw this in something you'd spoken about recently in an interview about the MoMA show, but this sort of gets back to you talking about it being a small world and you could kind of do anything you wanted. And you talked about how it's important for people to realize that no artist comes out of nowhere and out of nothing, and that particularly in those years when you came of age as an artist in the 60s here, there was a very small world, and of course there's competition among artists, but that there was really more of you drawing from each other.
I think it's the same now, in a very different way, because there's many more people. I don't think that ever changes. I think art comes from art.
But
it's a dialogue,
right,
with the past and the future.
But in those years when you, like with, with Richard Serra and Pat Steer and poets like Susan Howe and your friends, did you have the sense that you were a very small group doing something fairly radical?
Probably, but it's not what you talk about, if you know what I mean.
Right. I remember I know Jack Smith was also sort of a big deal for you, and you talking about there were times when you would go to a Jack Smith performance at midnight at his loft, and there'd be maybe 6 people, you included. So it seems like it was a self-selected group and a very small group.
Well, it wasn't selected at all.
Okay.
I mean, the way I was actually with Richard, and we're just back from Japan, where we've been looking at No drama, which you go for 4 or 5 hours or all day in the tradition of the No, and so we ran into Michael Snow, and he said, "You have to go see this Jack Smith." We didn't know about him. I had never heard of him. He's over on whatever. He was on Green Street or someplace, and probably most of you know this. He had a theater, which was it was a loft space on the ground floor, and the floor right above had been burned out, and so it was just a double floor loft space, and Jack was in one end of it, and there were about 6 or 10 people there, and he made these bleachers out of 2x4s that you sat on, and they'd go like this during the performance, the bleachers, and he would offer, I think it was probably marijuana, but he would offer a joint to people as they came in. It was a very different atmosphere, and Jack did this. When you first went there, we went every weekend for 4 hours at midnight, and Jack would, you saw a huge pile of stuff in the middle of the stage. It looked completely chaotic, and he would do things with the objects and blow bubbles and sing. He did all kinds of things. I wish somebody had recorded it, but they couldn't at that time. And so you'd go back the next weekend thinking it was just crazy. He'd do exactly the same thing. And that went on, and then he'd change it a little bit a few weeks later. So that was what that was about. And it really affected me deeply because it was also an example of the film and theater world at that time were a little bit separate. And the theater world was much more expressionistic, many of you know this, than the art world. And that's where Jack Smith came out of, and film, and Jonas Mekas, and so on. So these little worlds, they were next to each other, not necessarily knowing each other well, but interacting.
In those, I've read descriptions of those performances, those early Jack Smith performances, but was he using, in the loft, was he using projected film, or it was live performance?
It was live performance.
Okay. This takes us back just a minute, but I'm interested. You always talk about how your pieces are a response to thinking about space and about the space between the audience and the performer, or the space of sound, the space of distance. and you talked about early on, I think, the paintings of Piero della Francesca and Sassetta, and looking at that very narrow space, I guess it would be, in some of those, or it feels like
Now it's a flat space because they're paintings.
you're in a right, but you're in a room with even if you're looking at like Cimabue or Giotto, you're often in those rooms that feel like they've been crunched, and all the saints are in a very small amount of space. Anyway, that's the way I look at those. But what did space in Piero or Sassetta do to say
because
to you?
I studied art history and I loved Piero's work, for one, and then his spaces were these rooms that were defined, and people would be standing in the rooms, and I was so fascinated by the way they were standing on a floor, the illusion of space, the illusion of them being in the room and standing on a two-dimensional surface, which was the painting. And so that had a big effect on me. And then Sassetta, what I loved about his work was that he had several scenes going on at once, sometimes. You remember?
Mm-hmm.
And it would be like a little narrative, a medieval narrative. And the colors in Sassetta was so beautiful, sort of pastel. It was the early days of the pre-Renaissance,
Mm-hmm.
where things weren't quite perfect yet, which I like.
Right. We've talked about mirrors, but I'm interested in when video came along and the Sony Portapak came along. You were one of the first artists, I guess, who adopted it. I mean, I think Bruce Nauman used it pretty early on, and maybe, I guess, Dan Graham and maybe Vito Acconci.
Peter Campus.
And Peter Campus. And I remember I interviewed Bruce Nauman once, and he talked about this sort of lightning bolt feeling of realizing the difference in the feeling of immediacy with video. Not just that you could do it and look at it, but the actual feeling on the screen of immediacy when you compared it to film. And when did you become aware that you could use video as a tool, and how did you get your hands on it, and what did it start to do for you?
Well, I knew about it. I went to Japan in 1970, and of course I knew about it because there had been these little meetings with Peter and Bruce, and just to talk. I don't know why. And so I knew about the camera. And the thing about the video, it was like a revolutionary thing because you could sit, as you know, you could sit in your studio and see yourself, and you could see the process. You could make things for the camera and see immediately in the monitor. So there was no translation or waiting for the film to come back from the film studio. And also the quality of video, filmmakers hated it. They hated that grainy, black and white flatness. And so it was interesting then because there was a real separation between the film community and the people making videos who were devoted to it, by the way.
And in those early years, were you aware or looking at Bruce's work or Dan Graham's work or Nam June Paik? Were you looking at others and figuring out what you wanted to do in contradistinction to them?
I could never figure out anything until I got the material in my hands. I mean, I did get inspired by a couple of things like that, but that was figured out in the studio when you had the actual machines there and you were working with it. But I went to see everything. We all did.
I remember you when we had lunch last week and you were talking about sort of a lucky stroke of, that you through friends you knew you were around Henry Geldzahler, and then with Calvin Trillin from the New Yorker, Geldzahler he had his radar up and he would know about things that maybe you necessarily wouldn't, or Bud Trillin wouldn't, and you saw some great things back then because Geldzahler was out on the trail.
He was the first contemporary curator at the Met.
Right.
And anyway, he was a very good friend of Jerry Jonas's, who I was married to at the time. And he used to call up actually Bud because there was some kind of a rift. And Bud, who was not interested at all in these things, would call us, and we would go. So that's how I saw all the happenings in the 60s. Many happenings. I was very lucky with because of Henry, who told us. And then things, you get in touch with people and then you see more.
And do you remember which of those had a huge effect
Well,
on you?
Oldenburg, I don't know if he told us about Oldenburg, but Oldenburg had his store on the Lower East Side. It had a huge effect. It was wonderful. And it was a storefront, and you went in the door and you went down one side and came out the other. And in each room there was a performance going on. I remember Lucas Samaras was in the first room, and he kept picking up the phone saying, maybe, hello? Hello? Repeating things over and over again. And then in the back room was Patty Oldenburg with costumes. Anyway, I don't remember anything else, but it was a wonderful visual performance of Oldenburg.
And you told me a story last week about that I guess sort of goes to the subject of figuring out the audience for work, the kind of work that you and your peers are doing at that point. And I forget, this might have been at the Poetry Project, but you talked about doing an early mirror performance, maybe that involved laughing, and the audience just being stone cold silent. And you were sort of so rattled by the fact that it didn't seem like they liked it at all, that you literally left town and went to a trip to Egypt, and then returned, and a friend of yours said, how stunned she was by the. I'm probably getting this wrong, but how stunned she was by the performance, and a bit of a realization of learning an audience. I guess.
I'll put it in a few different words.
Okay.
So, I was on my way to. I'm going to say this in front of an audience. I was on my way to St. Mark's for the performance. It was part of the Tibet project. They put on, they tried to raise. Anyway, and on the way, this friend of mine came up and said, "Do you want a puff?" And that was a big mistake. I took a puff, and I went in there, and I was following Patti Smith. I had to follow her. And at that time, was this the early 70s? Yeah, the late 60s. I loved her singing. And the idea of following Patti Smith was a terrifying prospect. And so, because I was shy in the beginning. And so I got up, and my piece was holding a mirror like this and laughing, looking at myself in the mirror and laughing. And I had to just laugh, fake laugh, And the audience was deadly silent. Of course, they wouldn't laugh. It wasn't a funny thing. And then I rushed out of there. I was so humiliated that I did go to India.
Oh, India, right, okay.
But when I came back, and it was years later, now I can't remember their names. They used to work at Gagosian and at Castelli. These two friends of mine, men, came up to me and said, "Joan, that was the best performance we ever saw."
And was there, because what you were doing was so unconventional, was there a learning curve with audiences figuring out what, or did you care so much about the response of the audience?
A little bit, yeah.
Or what was, figuring out what you thought was successful, I guess is the question.
One doesn't, in my early days, I never knew, because you can't see yourself. And I could tell if a performance went over well. You can tell. People in the audience know that. The audience, you can feel the audience. But I didn't really, I was scared of the audience. But I did things to alleviate that. And a lot of people have stage fright, and it took me a while to get over it. Mm-hmm. As far as those early days, yeah. Well, I don't know. Let's go on.
Because you're having this huge moment here in the city where you were born and where you've done most of your work, I'm interested, looking at your work over the years. A lot of the early pieces were done, in the city, sometimes on the streets, using the buildings and the streets as a kind of a canvas, and then your studio, but then fairly early on, the countryside, and particularly Nova Scotia and Cape Breton, where you go for the summers, began to figure into the work, and the nature began to figure into the work. And I think I read somewhere that Susan Howe said, I cannot emphasize enough how important the sea is to Joan. And I'm wondering whether, over the long arc of your work, if you think there's a dialectic between the city and nature that plays out through the work.
Probably. I mean, one of my first videos was I Want to Live in the Country, and that was about the city and that was about Nova Scotia and about New York, juxtaposing them, which I haven't seen in a while, so I can't remember. But yeah, I did think about that. But then eventually the city disappeared out of their work in that way. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I always liked to perform in the city on the streets, but as I was just saying a little while ago to you, New York has changed, and there are no longer these empty lots and these holes. I like cities I would call them, in Berlin, a hole in the city. And Berlin had lots of holes in the 80s, but all the cities have been rebuilt, and so it doesn't interest me so much anymore in that way. Mm-hmm. But there could be a place to find, for sure.
Right. And you and others of that generation had a kind of a playground to a degree, in that there were places you could probably seemingly go with probably no permission, right?
You didn't need permission. No, Pat Steer and I set up this situation in Wall Street area, and a camera Andy man, and I asked Pat to come too, and we both had long dresses on. We went and we performed I took my tin cones down to Wall Street, and we were performing, and Andy was shooting us, recording us, and I have that. It's like a little film, and Pat and I are running around and dancing and everything, and this one man, we weren't bothered at all, and we needed no permission. You couldn't do that now, but this one man took a shining to Pat and started running around with us, chasing Pat.
It reminds me of, there's a story about Gordon Matta Clark, who was a friend of yours, and one of his unauthorized cuttings where he was, I think maybe in the Bronx, and with friends and chainsaws, and they're really carving up a building, and it's so loud and he can't hear, and then all of a sudden he looks up and there's two police officers with drawn guns, and he just, with all the confidence in the world, he stands up, puts on his hard hat, picks up a clipboard and says, "Demolition, the whole place." And they holstered their guns and walked away.
I didn't know that. That's great. I didn't know that.
So I guess there was situations like that. I was reading some things today, and you've written about developing pieces and trying hard to separate your own persona from the personas that you've created in the work, like Organic Honey. And you said the risk was becoming too submerged in solipsistic gestures. And I think, like, Roberta Smith has written pretty admiringly about your work, that you don't belabor things and you don't fall into ruts. And how hard is that to do, to not repeat yourself or feel like you're mining new ground, and aren't doing things that are solipsistic gestures?
Impossible. No, I mean, of course, you can't help but repeat yourself. But one of my goals was not to repeat myself. So it's like a discipline. You put yourself into a discipline. I'm not going to repeat my old work. I'm not going to be influenced by that work. I'm not going, you know what I mean? So you have your own boundaries that develop your work. And then whether or not those are true boundaries or not, it's just a discipline.
Right. And the curator of your MoMA show, Anna Janevsky, has written about how, you are, that you've really pioneered a way of taking your performances and the films of your performances and reconstituting them as installations in a way that becomes pretty Borgesian, because it scrambles the chronology, it scrambles places and times, and I think about other performance artists like Paul McCarthy or Chris Burden, who at a certain point felt that that performance had to move. They had to move beyond individual performances, and in the case of Paul, it becomes sculpture. in your case, at what point in your career did you start to think about taking a performance and a film and making a multi-part installation out of it?
Probably, I really concentrated on that in the 90s. I had a show at the Stedelijk Museum, which was going to be my performance, but I wouldn't be performing. It was the first time. Although I did a piece in '76 called Stage Sets. And I'll just say that all of my work, when I would begin a piece, I would make a space for myself, which would be like a stage set that I could step into, and then that would be the performance area. Because I had to step out of my own world into another world in order to make or do a performance. You know, it could be either disguising myself or working with props in a certain way. And so, what was I saying? I lost the concept.
Trying to figure out
Oh,
how
yeah.
to make that move into
So I was commissioned
taking the
to
documentation
do,
and
so
making it.
this was after Stage Sets, which was a big installation in Philadelphia. But then, in a few years later, I was asked to do this kind of a retrospective of what I've already done. And I was working with a curator named Doreen Mignot. And the first thing we did was take all my props and put them in the middle of the room and look at them. And we quickly decided that they cannot be shown by themselves. That's why, that's one of the things that turned into installation, the idea of installation. The props could only be shown with the piece that they're from and how they function in relation to. I mean, I have many objects and props that are not part of any work. And MoMA has, in that show, there are drawings. Everything in the MoMA show relates to a certain work.
Right.
Anyway, so all the installations are quite different from the way they were. I mean, the same elements, but very different from they were at the first Stedelijk show. I've been working on that. So I consider installation a form.
Right. And that sort of leads into this next question. And this is something I've asked a lot of artists involved with performance over the years about, including, Vito and Robert Whitman and Valley Export. Was there a certain point, especially in the 80s when the art world changed, when you felt pressure either coming from yourself or from the art world, the institutional or commercial art world, to make objects, to make things to sell?
No, I remember the 80s, and I was fine. The 70s, I was well known and people loved my work. The 80s came in like that. It switched to object and to, so I was kind of left outside of that, the kind of work I was doing. I went on working, but that's what happens in the 80s to me, which is fine, but that's what happened.
And what was your response to that?
Just to keep working.
Not to change.
No.
Not to think about
Nobody
objects.
individually asked me to change.
Right.
I was never asked to change.
Right.
It was just the atmosphere.
Yeah. And that sort of brings me to thinking about the drawings at the drawing show, and also the objects, the cones and viewing boxes and other objects that are in the installations at MoMA. Do you, and you answered part of this just a second ago, but do you ever think of a drawing as separate from performance? Like, do you
All the
have
time.
a drawing for exhibition that you feel like this didn't come out of performance and it's not even related to a performance?
Absolutely. I mean, I have about 2,000 drawings. They're not all good, for sure, but I just always drew. And I brought drawing, I made the decision when I switched to performance to bring drawing as a discipline into the work and to keep it there. So I always drew. I made drawings in relation to the subject, to the form. I tried to find different ways to make drawings for the monitor in relation to media, film. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that I just simply wanted to draw these objects that I had. So I would get obsessed with, I have a wooden owl at the MoMA. It was part of my collection. I collect, you could call it folk art, but I do collect it. And so the owl I drew over and over again because and so I do certain things over and over again. My dog, Xena, I've made many drawings of Xena not part of any performance, and so on.
And you don't think, I remember once Cy Twombly talked about painting and said, I mean, even when something was figurative in a painting of his, he said something along the lines of, it does not illustrate, the line is the experience of making it. And so to a degree, are the drawings, even if they're not emerging from a particular performance or the act of a performance, the drawings are performative? Or do you think of them in the way that anybody would have thought about drawings from
No, I don't
Renaissance?
think of them as performative. Doing a drawing in a performance live is a little different than being in your studio and making a drawing. There's many ways to make a drawing in relation to your body. In the studio, it's this, on the table. In the performance, it could be this, running around. It could be, many different ways in relation to your body. But in the studio, it's
Right.
on the paper.
And with objects like cones or viewing boxes, those things should not be in museums as discrete objects, as sculptures. They have to be related to, they need to be related to what they came out of in the performance.
I think so, but who knows?
Right.
No, because the cones work best when they're in the situation in which they were made for. But I did work with cones for years. That was another obsession, were cones. I made paper cones and tin cones, and I worked with cones. The shape is a wonderful shape in many different ways.
Right, right. You've probably been asked this too much recently, but do you feel any frustration that a retrospective of this magnitude here in New York is coming only now, and that you've been here for as long as you have, and you're such a huge influence on, a pioneer and an influence on, especially on younger artists, that it's taken this long? I mean, you've had a lot of, especially in Europe, there's been no shortage, but I would say that.
No, there was actually very little here for many years, and it wasn't a tragedy, but I felt a little bad. I wanted to show in my own hometown, and I wanted to show in America and have people here see the work. And so it just happened. And I've had little shows here in galleries, for sure. But I think it would be crazy to say I'm upset or frustrated, because now it's there. And so, it's great. I'm happy with it. And it's not too late.
Right, right. And do you have the sense that I was there, not long ago, and the galleries at MoMA were packed, and that part of that is because, even though I would say in some ways the art world, especially compared to the 60s and 70s, has become more conservative, but there are ways in which it seemed like you presaged certain things about our mediated life and about the way we live and the fragmented nature of our existence, that your work feels pretty of the moment. And do you feel like a pendulum has sort of swung back to people understanding your work and seeing something in it?
I don't think of it that way, as a pendulum of them swinging back, or I really didn't think about people not liking my work or not understanding it. I know that a lot of people have a hard time understanding my work because of maybe the layers, and I don't explain everything. But it never bothered me. It's not an issue for me. I don't think of it as a pendulum. I don't see it that way. There are a lot of things that you might say, or somebody else, that are said by others. I can't say them. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I don't say the pendulum has swung back to me.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's more a question about history itself, and you think about the 80s and the art world and what people prized did change.
I mean, I always called myself an artist because I felt unrecognized, but I had many artist friends who've supported me, and thank you very much. It got me through the whole thing of the many artist friends who supported me, who liked my work, who always came, and that's a big plus and wonderful in one's life.
Right. I wanted to talk, and this might bring us to questions, but I wanted to talk about dogs. And you, I think maybe as early as maybe duet, you know, when you were howling and barking, that you'd already brought that in as a refrain, the action of a dog, if not the form of a dog. But dogs have been through, you know, all of your work. I was thinking about the when you had the American Pavilion in Venice in 2015, and the sound of the dog walking. What besides loving dogs as for themselves, what does a dog mean in your work, and what's it brought to the work as a symbol
Well, one of the
or
ways I talk about that,
form?
in order to excuse myself for having the dog, because when I began in the 60s, people like me were all talking about witches, you know, performance in relation to witches, but not black witches or bad witches, but witches in general. And I began to get, I have to say, a little scared of that. But witches always had a cat, you know? So for me, it was a dog. And the dog was an animal helper. An animal helper. The cat is the animal helper also. But a dog can be an animal. A horse can be an animal helper. They have the energy that drives you. This is the way I used to explain it. That drives you through. You know, the energy of the animal drives you in a different way. And I started working with, her name was Sappho, in the organic honey pieces, because she was there. You know, it was things in my life that I work with. So the dogs are in my life. After Sappho, I had Zena, who was a brilliant performer. And now I have Ozu, which he is not interested in performing.
And how many dogs have been in your life?
Well, many, but as an adult, 3.
3. Right. The last question I have is about the metaphysical, and you know, with your interest in myth and fairy tale and nature. I forget what, you know, if you were raised Catholic or what, but like what?
Very Protestant, no.
Protestant, but do you have metaphysical feelings, and do they come into the work?
I'm not sure.
Or are you a strict materialist, rationalist at heart?
I think I'm more of that, but I also have some of those, but which I don't talk about. But I'll just tell you how I started to be interested in the idea of myth. I mean, you know, when we're growing up and when we're reading, we read about mythology. It's part of our lives, and we read literature, and so on. So I read James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and in it there's a mythological figure, Sisyphus, and Sisyphus flew too close to the sun, right? Flew too close to the sun and fell. Anyway, that myth informed Joyce's, that book, Portrait of the Artist. And that influenced me because I saw that you could use myth in a way to point out something or represent something that you couldn't in other ways. And so that was a long time ago. That was in the early, I don't know, whatever, 60s. And so then that's how I began working with that idea. And yeah.
Right.
But, you know, yeah, that's how I began.
Right. But in the way that the work is received, you don't, there's not an, I guess,
people don't like to talk about that.
About metaphysics?
No, they don't like to talk about spiritual things.
Right.
I mean, people who write, although Chrissy Isles wrote a very long and wonderful essay in one of my catalogs about that because I had talked to her about that.
About the spiritual.
Or about myth, yeah, and how does myth function and spirit,
right.
How do they function? So I am a rationalist, but I have that other side also, which side by side, which can be together.
Right, right. I think we talked the other day about, there's that thing in Borges where he talked about studying the ancient world And the further back you go, the more fragmentary it becomes. And he says it's a great way to enrich your ignorance. And it seems like myth is it's another great way to do that. It's showing you something, and myth is our collected wisdom to a degree. But there's also so much in myth that just increases the mystery, or I guess enriches the ignorance.
Yeah, and also the many different cultures.
Right, right.
But Borges was so relevant because of the way he looks at the world. It multiplies, the staircase that goes all the way up, the multiple levels and how things multiply. And mirrors for him represented that. They also said they were abominable. Remember that quote?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, thinking about the Garden of the Forking Paths, like quantum physician, people in quantum physics talk about the way that short story works.
Really?
As being essentially quantum.
Oh, I'd love
because,
to.
several things are taking place simultaneously. Several different histories are
right.
taking place
Yeah.
simultaneously. So, okay, well, I think we'll open it up for questions, unless I've missed any huge piece of it. Yes.
Anyways, Joan, I just want to say, my sister Patty and I were at the Castelli Gallery in the Dark Ages. But what I wanted to say was how magical the bubble was in the late 60s and 70s, and how women artists were able to create and do things in a very female thing. They brought a female sensibility to the art, and that wasn't, degraded or thought not as good as what the men were doing. Your videos were right up there with Bruce Nouns, but you also had a freedom. And I think what's interesting, and I think that people here should know, is that as an artist like yourself, or Anna Wilke, or Carolee Schneemann, or the people that, or even Pat Steer, or whatever, have that kind of freedom that gave them the spirit to go on and do whatever they wanted to do forever. And I think that, I don't know if that's so much true now for a lot of women artists, but I think that's what makes you all amazing.
Well, I'll say something about that. Just a short thing is that when I was going to go, the men did dominate painting and sculpture at that time, right? And performance and video, there were relatively few men and mostly women. And so those areas were very free. And then, of course, painting, you had to claim your territory. It was a little bit more difficult, but Pat did very well.
The crossover between, there's a lot more openness between dance and music and the arts, so that artists were much more free about asking other artists to participate.
Well, that's true, because it was a smaller group, and you asked your friends. Like the piece I did outside on the Lower West Side, I just called up all my friends and said, come together, we're going to do something. And then they would all come, and we'd improvise, for several weeks together. And that's what, that's one of the ways that happened.
Yes.
Did you ever think you were on the wrong path?
Pardon me?
Did you ever think you were on the wrong path?
On the what?
On the wrong path.
No, never.
And one for you, Randy. What was the Borges short story called that the quote was from?
The piece about enriching ignorance is not from a short story. It's from an essay that he wrote about that. It's at a certain point starts talking about the study of ancient history, and that the further you go back, the more fragmentary and uncertain it becomes, and so you have to. You're essentially making things up, or you're inferring things, and it enriches your ignorance, which is.
That was the one you rummaged around for.
Oh no, the quote from the beginning about mirrors, about his he had a horror of mirrors, was from an essay that he wrote later in his life that was specifically just an essay about mirrors.
Which you have to show me. I've never read it.
Yeah. It's short. but it's like a prose poem about mirrors, mostly a
Right.
kind of terror of them.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, back there. Can you speak loudly?
Yes, hi. How much, looking at your early work and when you work in the video with a lot of participants, how much of that is choreographed or did you explain an idea to them? Like I'm thinking particularly of the mirrors, walking around with the mirrors and.
Totally choreographed.
Sorry?
Totally choreographed. I'll just say, I mean, I don't know if that's your question,
Yeah.
That's my question.
but
Yeah.
totally, everything I do when I show it in a live situation is choreographed. Although lately, like the performance I did the other night with Jason, we have certain things we do, and it's not choreographed in the same way. But the mirror, I mean, all the early work is choreographed. So I would never show something that was just not choreographed. And the mirror piece, you know, it took a lot of rehearsal, and we're going to do it again at MoMA. And right now, just to tell you about that one piece, the Tate bought it, which is unusual for them to buy a performance. And there's a woman that I know and chose, a wonderful young woman who's a dancer, is in charge of that installation. And she will come to New York, put out an ad, get all the people, and train them how to do this version that she and I looked at. It's all based on the original version, totally choreographed. Anyway, does that answer your question? Okay.
Actually, I want to ask a question off of that, which is, to what degree in the performances, even though they're choreographed, did you take hold of chance or?
I mean, always, but not in the actual performance. But something would happen, and yeah, I did. But chance is not. I mean, when you improvise, you run into chance, of course, and that's what improvisation is. And so you use that, but then you have to transform it and put it into something.
Right. Do we have another? Yes.
So you had said earlier that art comes from art, and it's a dialogue between the past and the future. I'm just curious what you hope your artwork to communicate to future generations.
Maybe somebody else should answer that question. I mean, we don't know.
But what do you hope?
No, I don't hope for it. I'm very glad that young people are coming to see my work. Very glad. Very happy about it. And older people, whoever comes to see it. But I don't know. I don't know. I cannot read an audience's mind. So I don't know exactly what they're experiencing. You know, everybody sees things differently. And well, anyway. I'm only glad that there are young people coming and that there are people seeing it and that it will have an effect, I hope.
There was another question right in front of, yes.
Speaking of that, I was wondering, putting aside history or retrospective analysis, you personally, what performance was most meaningful to you?
Pardon me, what? What was the last part of the question?
What was personally most meaningful to you, putting aside like retrospective analysis or external critiques or, just really personally meaningful to you? If there were to be like a couple that were.
You mean, are you asking which performance?
Yeah.
Choose among your children.
I know. I appreciate your question. I don't think of my work in that way, that I have a favorite this or a favorite that. There are certain things. I just did a performance with Jason Moran. I love that. I'd love to do it again. It's not my favorite. I mean, I'm not saying it is a favorite, but it's not, if you see what I mean.
It's
It's
very experiential.
a little bit, yeah. And also, what's relevant for now? There are certain early performances I would never repeat. I couldn't, physically. I did it when I had my show at the Tate. I made up a performance in relation to the original performance of Mirage, And it was interesting, at my age, I couldn't even stand up and sit down by myself. You know what I mean? So you can't do certain things. You cannot. And even if something is your favorite, Mirage is one of my favorite pieces. And I'm glad I did that performance, but it was really weird. I didn't realize it until I looked at the footage of me at my age performing against me in the 70s. Very weird.
I know that on that score, having talked to like Joan Jonas, when he would talk about beginning to adapt his voice because he got older and the breath wasn't the same, and the ability to do those the way he had done them earlier and adapting to that, and I guess also Merce Cunningham adapting to aging as a dancer. Do you think did when you conceive performances that involve you, do you think about that and adapting it
yes.
to?
I don't adapt things. I just know that I can, it's like in the next performance, I don't put difficult things into the performances at all anymore. And I didn't realize that sitting down and standing up was going to be difficult. But it was like really on a very low stage and not like getting out of a chair. So, of course, I think about that. But it's possible.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you felt a shift in your connection with nature from the beginning of your work throughout your work into the later pieces? Do you feel your viewpoint towards nature as a participant in your film, has it changed how you perceive it, or how sort of it, I see it as a character in a lot of your work as a participant, and I'm just wondering if your connection with it and your viewpoint with it has changed over time from your earlier to your later work.
I've never thought of that. So it's hard for me to answer the question. I mean, I just did a new piece at MoMA that's part of the show about whales, and it was a dedication to this marine biologist that I was working with, David Gruber, who was working with whales. And I wanted to, because he also, in a piece called Moving Off the Land, David gave me a lot of his footage. He's a marine biologist, which I used in my work. I put it in. I didn't change it at all, but I used it as backgrounds. And we did this together, but I did the performance, and he just gave me, his footage. And so I wanted to do kind of an homage to him. And so it was about the whales. And you can say I'm a little outside of that. I'm not in it myself at all. And maybe I wouldn't want to run around in the field the way I used to. It has to do with my physicality, really. But yeah, I don't know what else to say. I don't have any plans for pieces in the future in the nature, but who knows, Sorry, I can't. It's hard to answer that.
Well, I have a follow-up to that one too, which is, as the awareness of the threat to the planet and climate deepens, does your engagement with nature as an artist, has it deepened?
I see what you mean.
I mean, that's a
yes,
corollary to that, I guess.
Yes. I mean, the subject, I was influenced by Haldor Laxness, who wrote something called Under the Glacier, which I love. And I think that was the book I used. Anyway, but when I started working on it, I said, under the glacier, glaciers are melting. So that had to be part of the piece, the fact that glaciers are melting. So yes, my attitude toward nature and my involvement with it has changed because of that. Because nature is changing, nature is in trouble. So the subject matter of my work is affected by that, yes.
Yes.
So, thank you for being here. So, I really like the performance of Delay, and I saw in the MoMA show you included the part the Italian students redid it in Venice in the smaller space, and I was just like thinking because your work as it didn't spend a very long period of time, I guess a lot of people get inspired and replicate it.
Sorry.
And,
She was talking about delay, and about it being re-performed by a group. What was it? A group of Italian students.
Oh, well, I can tell you about
And,
that.
and saying, like, I guess the question might be about your openness to
Well, I mean, that's a
people
very
taking it and
a
reinterpreting.
nice little story in relation to that. Those Italian young artists were working with me in Venice and helping, working for me and to put up the piece. And they said, we have a surprise for you. And their surprise was that performance that they put together without me at all. And I liked it very much, what they did.
And I would assume that would not always be the case.
Well, actually, there was another. No, but there was another example of a group in Italy who did a performance, and it was so weird. I can't explain to you how weird it was. And it was like they really took off. And then I sort of liked it. At first, I hated it, and then I liked it. So, it takes some. It's interesting to see how people might go off on a tangent, and you can't stop it. There's no rules.
Yes.
I was just wondering about politics because it's such a political time, and I was thinking that I find your work very political, but in a poetic way, and an aesthetic, poetic, politic group, mishmash. But I was wondering, in your life as an artist, since you lived through a period of incredible earlier upheaval, not maybe dissimilar from now, where there's this schism between like very intense activist politics, maybe versus a certain kind of body politic or philosophical politic. And I was just wondering, out of curiosity, if you went through some periods where, because you were talking about this social bubble, this small group of artists, like, I was wondering if you sometimes felt in older times if you guys felt alienated or a schism between this kind of like, useful politic versus, how did you deal? Were there times where this was really tense?
Well, I'll just explain one thing. I guess in the mid '70s, well, during the Vietnam War, that was a moment of being really feeling alienated from the culture. But anyway, during the time that many of us were in our lofts doing these esoteric, black and white, poetic things, there was this war going on. And it's a little bit what's going on now, I have to say. And so I included, I purposely made a piece. I can't remember very well. I think Mirage was about that. I made a piece where I juxtapose elements in the studio to political things. I have to remember. It's a good question, Amy. But I can't remember exactly what I did. But yes, there were moments like that. And I saw the big difference between what we were doing in our studios, esoteric, hidden, in a small culture, and then what was going on in the world. And so, yeah, that had a big effect, I'm sure, on many people, actually. And then now, right now, one thinks, well, now what do I do? Can I make a statement? Can I do anything? It's really, we're in another troubled time in relation to that. But I don't have, right now, any kind of answer, or I don't even know what I could do. But I think, one feels the need to do something, but one doesn't know how. Or to say something, I think we're in an unfortunate situation.
And this is a follow-up to that, but do you think that art can, thinking about that work then, and it wasn't being explicitly activist or political, that art, just by its very nature, can affect change just by altering consciousness and awareness?
I'm sure, yes, I'm sure that's true. I'm not sure how effective art is with the politicians that we're dealing with. They do not give a shit.
Yeah.
about art. Excuse me, but
Right.
they don't. And yeah, but I do think, of course, that you can alter people's perception and you can influence their ideas for sure. Yes.
I remember reading there was a Trotsky when like toward the end of his life wrote a letter, and he was trying to tell his compatriots who were asking about what the duty of art was, because the Soviet program had already started to really latch it to nationalism, and he said that art served the revolution best by serving its own purposes, which I thought was great. By which he meant it should do its own thing, and that's revolutionary in and of itself, even if it's not supporting the official line of the government.
Well, we don't know quite what support in this country.
Right. Right.
I mean, also, I don't know. Well, anyway, that's an interesting point.
Yeah. All right. Unless I'm missing a hand, I think that will do it. And I would like to give a hand to Joan Jonas.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to thank Philip Spradley for arranging this. There he is in the back of the room.